You are listening to Demystifying Organizations. In partnership with McGraw-Hill Education, I'm your host, Jeff Schatten. Before we get started with today's guest, just a note, if you have questions or comments, you can email me at jeffschatten1@gmail.com. You can tweet me at Jeff Schatten. If you like this podcast, press the subscribe button and make sure to rate it on iTunes so that other people can find it. There's so much to be said about my guest today, Douglas Rushkoff. It's hard to know where to start. Douglas was named one of the world's 10 most influential intellectuals by MIT. Douglas Rushkoff is an author and documentarian who studies human autonomy in a digital age. His 20 books include the just-published Team Human, which we discuss on the podcast today. Rushkoff's work explores how different technological environments change our relationship to narrative, money, power, and one another. He coined such concepts as viral media, screenagers, and social currency, and has been a leading voice for applying digital media towards social and economic justice. Douglas is a columnist for Medium, technology and media commentator for CNN, a research fellow at the Institute for the Future, and a lecturer on media, technology, culture, and economics all around the world. He has written and hosted 3 award-winning PBS Frontline documentaries. Douglas is a professor of media theory and digital economics at CUNY Queens, and I'm honored to have him on as a guest today. I'd like to welcome Douglas Rushkoff to the pod. Thanks so much for coming on.
And thanks for having me.
So this book, Team Human, is going to be coming out soon. It's a manifesto. It touches on technology, anthropology, ethics, economics, religion, philosophy, and public policy, just to name a few areas. It's a pretty wide-scoping book about where we are technologically, how we should think of ourselves as human beings in terms of technology, and it's a pretty incredible read. I really enjoyed it. So thanks for coming on the pod.
Oh, thanks.
I thought we'd get started. Could you begin by reading a section from the book about digital marketing?
Sure. Oh, that's interesting. I see it about. I mean, yeah, I never think I'm writing about marketing, but I guess that's what this really is. All right, so this is a little section 34. The whole book is these little sections. Instead of designing technologies that promote autonomy and help us make informed decisions, the persuasion engineers in charge of our biggest digital companies are hard at work creating interfaces that thwart our cognition and push us into an impulsive state where thoughtful choices, or thought itself, are nearly impossible. We know now, beyond any doubt, that we are dumber when we are using smartphones and social media. We understand and retain less information, comprehend with less depth, and make decisions more impulsively than we do otherwise. This untethered mental state, in turn, makes us less capable of distinguishing the real from the fake, the compassionate from the cruel, and even the human from the non-human. Team Human's real enemies, if we can call them that, are not just the people who are trying to program us into submission, but the algorithms they've unleashed to help them do it.
So it's a really interesting passage and calls into question the role that modern technology has in our life. So if you were to just frame, what are your biggest concerns about our relationship with these digital technologies?
I guess my concern is that we end up automating processes that we haven't really evaluated in their non-automated states. So if we have a manipulative consumer culture, or if we have certain assumptions about the way that human beings need to serve the market by buying more stuff faster, or if we have understandings about people as resources, from whom to extract value and feed it to shareholders. It's one thing when we do that as kind of mean marketers or mean CEOs doing this stuff to people. But once we automate those processes, once we tell a multi-trillion-dollar technology industry to automate those things, to write programs for those things and put them on automatic, then I get concerned that we end up not just doing mean things to one another, person to person, but we end up creating a landscape that's designed to do this, and that people growing up on that landscape just accept it as reality rather than as a construct.
So at the end of the day, though, don't we end up just with better advertisements? So what I mean is that where it used to be, right, where I'm watching TV, I'm not in a place to buy a car, and there's a Ford popping up, and that's just not good for me. But if I am interested in buying a pair of jeans, shouldn't that be the ad that pops up to me?
Sure, if that's what you want.
So the algorithms are going to do that. So you
believe, and that's all right, let's think about it this way. You believe that the algorithms are here not to help corporations sell you what they have, but to help corporations understand what you really, really want, so then they can deliver that to you.
Well, no, it's the two sides of the same coin, right? And we'll get to where it gets really dangerous, but from a macro level, right? That they're going to extract more profit. Clearly, it's profit oriented, but it doesn't do anyone any good for me to be given advertisements that don't suit me.
So you believe that the fact that you're going to be served advertisements is a given?
I think that's probably a given.
All right. Now, in what situations should the advertisements come and not come? So if you're in bed with your loved one and you're using, in your world, some augmented reality things, do you want Alexa to suggest to you a better condom that you could be using? Right? Why not?
Sure,
if
sure.
She's there.
And it gets really dark really quickly, but it gets invasive and dark very quickly. But here's what I want to push back on, is so a large theme of the book is that we should be very skeptical of all technology, and that there are these dangers, and it makes us less human. It prevents human interaction. It reduces what you call authentic engagement between people on a micro level, which certainly has its truth to it. But the larger structure, right, that if I'm looking to buy something, or if I'm concerned if there's something that I'm interested in, it's more effective at giving me what I want.
When you're in the market, it would be great if the marketplace made the things that you really want most available to you at any given time. My question is, when are you in the market and when are you not?
So what would an ideal internet look like?
An ideal internet? Well, the original internet was in some ways the ideal internet. Because it was government funded, and because the servers were all run at universities, there was a rule on the internet that you couldn't use it for advertising at all. The original ethos of Google, if you can imagine this, when its two young Stanford founders were talking about Google's advantage over Yahoo, was they said Google will always be great because we're not letting advertising on our platform. That they were arguing that once you have advertising funding your search, then you're no longer really giving people an honest, open map of the world's information. Now you're really giving them the information that people with money want you to have in the format you want to have it. So as I see it, an ideal internet would be one where it was funded by something other than advertising. I look at, and I know in a certain case it's elite, but when you look at the, say, the difference in programming on pay channels and broadcast channels, although now you pay for your broadcast channels too. I guess most people now seem to have cable and they're paying hundreds of dollars just to watch TV that used to be free in addition to what else is there. But when you're paying for your TV, then you're the customer. So then the content that's being given to you is for the most part, is for you. When you're watching an advertising-based platform, then you're not the customer. Then you are, as we've said a lot, then you're the product being delivered to, whoever is sponsoring that content. And that's just a different arrangement. It's when we go from purchasing content to becoming part of this attention economy, and we pay with our attention. So you're going to get different kinds of content. You're going to get content that helps marketers sell whatever it is they're selling. And that's, I'm not saying that's good or bad. It's sort of the Google model versus the Apple model, where in Apple you pay a whole lot in order to have these technologies that are, at least theoretically, configured for you, or you go on to Google and you're using, or Facebook, for which is a worse example, where you're using technologies that are designed to deliver you and your content to whoever's paying for the platform.
Yeah, I think Facebook's a great example of the just unforeseen results of what would happen when you just connect everybody.
Unforeseen by some. But for unforeseen by him, because he was a kid. And he couldn't be expected. And he shouldn't have been expected to understand the social, political, and global consequences of what he was doing.
So this is where I think the key role of government regulation comes in. Maybe this is where I would just, from my perspective, would like to see for-profit companies, because I think that's the only way that you can scale. And you can have technologies that are at the scale that we're talking about. But why government regulation is so important, for example, in Europe, where they passed the Right to be Forgotten Act. So right. you have the right to appeal and get your information off of Google. We don't have those kind of things here. What's your opinion about what do you think about the role of government in our current context?
Yeah, America is a very tricky place, because in America, increasingly, government is seen as the enemy. And a lot of that traces all the way back to, and he was well-meaning, but to, John Barlow's original Declaration of Independence of Cyberspace. And this was back in the heady days of the mid-90s, when it looked like the internet was going to be kind of like its own international country. And John Barlow wrote this Declaration of Independence, which said, governments of the world, beware. We don't need you. We're doing our own thing. Stay away. And what those of us who were enamored of that declaration kind of didn't take into account at the time is that if you get rid of government online, you just create a free anything goes landscape for corporations.
What could go wrong?
Yeah, exactly. What could go wrong?
What could possibly go wrong?
We didn't realize that government and corporations on a certain level, when they're not in cahoots with each other, they kind of balance each other out, like bacteria and fungus in your body. If you take a strong antibiotic and get rid of all the bacteria, then the fungus grows, out of control. That's sort of what happened. We got rid of government, and then, oh my gosh, the whole thing, all of a sudden, it was a .com boom, and everyone's advertising and banner ads and scams and .com and we underestimated really capitalism's ability to permeate and to really accommodate itself in some ways to this new medium. Those of us who understood capitalism and marketing as this TV thing, okay, they're not going to be able to just pipe advertisements at us anymore because it's interactive and you can click away, or we're not even doing content. We are the content. Everybody's one another's thing. We didn't really see that they would create the platforms on which all of this content happened. You know, these big companies are kind of all doing a version of what AOL did. They help people, they make the internet easier on a certain level. Oh, we'll make it easy for you to have a website by just coming on Facebook and entering in a few answers about your favorite movies. Or we'll make it, you know, easy for you to do this or that, but really what you're doing is functioning on top of a platform that's owned by a company with very particular goals in mind. And once they establish a monopoly, it's really hard to then get off it.
There's an interesting article I was reading about how if you have 75 things that you like on Facebook, Facebook knows you better than your parents do. If you have 150 things that you've liked, Facebook knows you better than your spouse. If you have 300, Facebook knows you better than you know yourself. And that at a certain point, right, the algorithms, and you mentioned this in your book, right, they can predict whether you're pregnant before you know that you're pregnant. It can predict what movies you're going to watch before you're interested in a certain movie. I mean, it is that powerful.
Right. I mean, it's powerful along a whole host of certain kinds of things. I mean, it can't know. I would argue there's aspects of your humanity it can't understand, but for the things it can know, yes or no, are you pregnant or not, you got the flu or not, you're gonna find out that you're gay or not. Yeah, it knows that with about 80% accuracy, better than you do. The question is, what do they really do with that? And I don't, and like you say, I don't even mind so much if they know with 80% accuracy that my wife and I are going to begin undergoing fertility treatments in a month, even though we don't, and then my news feed starts to get filled with, articles about fertility treatments and what to try and what not to try, and even if they're sponsored by different people, that's not necessarily so heinous. The part that bothers me the most is when my news feed, when my ads change as a result of that 80% probability, what if I were in the 20% of people who weren't going to go down that road? If Facebook knows with 80% accuracy that I'm going to go on a diet, they want to get that other 20% to go on a diet too. They want their accuracy to go up from 80% to 90%. And they don't do that by honing their predictive skills. They do that by calling on PJ Fogg in the Stanford Keptology Lab and trying to figure out, how do we get those 20% of miscreants, of people who are not behaving true to their algorithmically determined statistical profile, and how do we get them in line? So if they think I'm going to go on a diet, I'm going to start seeing stuff in my news feed that's pushing me towards worrying about my weight, that's going to exacerbate the thing. So if I'm someone who's worried about my gun rights, there are certainly people who are willing to make me very worried about my gun rights, or very worried about an invasion of Mexicans, jumping over walls in Mexico. So what we end up with is a kind of almost a centrifugal effect, or a magnification and amplification. Because again, the algorithms have a job to do, and we've set them out to do it. So they're making us more predictable, more brittle. They're ironing out the anomalous behavior, the crazy, unpredictable things, in order to automate as much of society as possible. And that's the part that worries me. We're in a place where we need new ideas. We need some crazy people. We need some novel thinking. This is the exact moment in our civilization where we want to not go automatically over the cliff into climate change or whatever it is that's going to happen. And so that's why I worry that we're becoming so much more dependent on, addicted to, and enamored of our newfound ability to use algorithms to automate human behavior, that we are nullifying or muting the most important qualities of humanity right now.
So you talk a lot about co-ops as a solution to part of the problem. Explain what a co-op is first.
Well, co-op is really just a worker-owned business. It's the easiest way to say it. It's where it's kind of the opposite of socialism. Socialism is largely about kind of redistributing the spoils of capitalism after the fact to try to help make things more even. And cooperativism is more about the workers own the means of production before the fact. It's our company. So if Uber were a co-op, it would mean instead of working for the shareholders, the Uber drivers are working for themselves and one another, that they own Uber. And the more you drive, the larger percentage of the company you would own.
So, and co-ops have been very successful in numerous places. We've seen them with small banks. You see it with small agricultural groups. One of the larger ones would be Ace Hardware. But as you'll notice, right, the scale stops at an Ace Hardware. So how do you do something that's technologically heavy, or something like an Apple, a Google, a Facebook, that does not require $1 billion as the full company, but $100 billion or $500 billion that's going to need to raise capital that's 10, 20, $30 billion to make a project happen? How would a co-op step into that space realistically?
Well, first off, I don't know how many of those companies there really are. In other words, I don't know that scale is the appropriate goal for a lot of companies that have even grown very big. But they can. So
it's not that scale is the goal. It's that for a lot of human endeavors, for example, Tesla creating their next car, their next electric vehicle, it simply can't be done with $20 million.
Right. So you look at Mondragon, which is a Spanish cooperative working at scale. They've got giant industrial companies. It's really not that hard if you make your workers part owners. Publix is Publix isn't a multi-billion, I guess, or is it? The grocery store chain. It's big. But the beauty of it is that a co-op can grow to scale slowly but surely. It can happen. But you're saying, okay, so what if you need you need ahead of time a whole bunch of capital? So you need to raise, say, $50 billion in order to start your Hyperloop tunnel system or something, right? So you're gonna dig tunnels across the country and under the ocean to connect America and Europe and America with itself. And you're going to need, $500 billion to get this off the ground. How do you make that a co-op? I guess what you do is you go back to Adam Smith and you accept that the factors of production are threefold. It requires land, it requires labor, and it requires capital. And all three of those partners have an ownership stake in the business. So yeah, the capital, those guys, they put the money, they get a third of everything for their money. The people who are working, they get a third because they're working it. And the towns under whose property this Hyperloop is going, the people that actually are providing the land, they get a third too. So the municipalities aren't, contending with foreign corporations exploiting their land. They're a part owner in it too. And then
you can see the challenge of this, right? So this, I just want to just provide a little bit of pushback, which would be, and this is where you and I probably just fundamentally differ, whereas, and not by much, right? I think we share many of the same concerns. I think this is the role of government regulation, but there's nothing that produces that can scale up and scale down quite like a corporation.
No, I would argue, but corporations, when they scale up, they damage people. When they scale down, they damage people. So it's true. Nothing can scale up or down like a corporation because corporations are regulated in such a fashion that they're allowed to destroy the planet and ruin people's lives.
Right. And so so this is where I think we would have a lot of agreement, which is where the government needs to regulate this space. And it's unfortunate that the elected officials fundamentally do not understand digital space, do not understand how any of this stuff works, which we saw when a senator, I don't remember who, asked Mark Zuckerberg, "What exactly do you do? How does this make money?"
Right.
And Mark Zuckerberg said,
"Right." But
we sell advertisements. So.
Right, but my pushback against corporatism here, it's like saying, yes, there's nothing that can scale up or down like a corporation. Likewise, there's nothing that can clear out a crowded subway station like an AK-47, right?
Fair enough. So here's I guess the next part of it, which is that given that these for-profit corporations are here, how can they better be a part of Team Human as opposed to the flip side?
Oh, I mean, that's easy. I mean, it's funny. I wrote a book about this in the early 2000s, and it was considered really controversial at the time. I was arguing that corporations should find a core competency. In other words, that they should focus on creating value, either by developing a product or developing a service. And this was very, very radical thinking in the late 90s, early 2000s, because that was the era of this guy, Jack Welch, who was running GE. And what he had discovered was that GE made less money manufacturing and selling a washing machine than they did lending money to someone to buy a washing machine. So he said, why should we be the sucker with this low return washing machine business? He sold the value creating industries of GE in order to become something much more like a bank, because you make more per dollar as a bank than you do actually making something or providing some service. And it worked right until the stock market crash of the economic crisis of 2007. And then this big former industrial company, which was really not they were not as sophisticated as a Goldman or a Credit Suisse at the industry they decided to enter. They're still paying the price. I mean, they may not survive, people are realizing now. I mean, they're trying to buy back their productive industries. So there's the point is that if corporations actually choose something that they know how to do and to develop that, then you end up with a very different kind of a culture. Then, and Apple had this for a while. REI has it to some extent. Even Steelcraft has this to some extent. Caterpillar, Cemex, the cement company. Companies where you have really super qualified nerds at the very core of the company who understand some technology or some process or some thing that they do so much better. The problem is once a company gets too big, like an Eli Lilly or a Squibb or most of these pharmaceutical companies, they lose the ability to retain or train talent. The only way then they can innovate is by purchasing some other company that is doing that innovation. And that's a shame. So the company that was doing something, even like Google, it becomes a holding company. They become a company that buys and sells companies that actually innovate. And that's no longer really doing business. That's kind of gaming the industry. That's becoming more of a finance company than a technology company or a real world company.
So I'm going to offer some things that we see some companies doing that I think does provide, this kind of middle ground. So one is employee stock options, right? So every publicly traded company is going to give stock options up high, but there are many companies that give stock options down low, where you even there's some where even someone making $12 or $15 an hour is given some kind of stock option.
Right, and imagine what that would be like for the Uber drivers. Uber drivers or any employee who's basically a fair number of employees now. Their main function is to train the artificial intelligences that are going to be replacing them. So if you're driving an Uber car, Uber's monitoring all your motions, everything you do, and it's machine learning algorithms for when those cars will be autonomous vehicles and not humans anymore. But if you, as an Uber driver, owned some small piece of the company through an ESOP, through an employee, although they don't want to call them employees, but through a worker, a freelancer stock option plan, then at least you would partly own the robot replacement. You would have been doing research and development for a company that you're actually a part of. But, the gig economy that we've created in this anti-human employment marketplace, this is what Team Human is about. We have an anti-human bias embedded in our business practices. And that started all the way back in the industrial age. That started back when we made, small business illegal and forced people to work for chartered monopolies and, in the early Renaissance, when that's what the kings did. They gave an industry to a particular friend of theirs, and then if you were a shoemaker, you couldn't work as a shoemaker anymore. You had to work as an employee of His Majesty's Royal Shoe Company. And once you moved from a small business person who owned what they did, who sold the value they created, to an employee who sold time, who sold as a wage earner, that's when workers lost their power. And even unionization, it still doesn't really solve that basic problem. You're just negotiating for better wages for your hours, but you're not connected to the value you're creating. What you're talking about with employee stock ownership or with employees buying back companies, a lot of boomers who have kids who don't want to take over their companies, they're finding it's actually tax beneficial to just give their companies to the employees, and then the employees learn to run them. I think about that all the time as a university professor when I look at how these giant administrations there's more administrators than there are professors, how much all this costs and what they're pushing and how they market this stuff. Wow, what if a bunch of professors got together, said, let's start a university and let's hire some people to administrate it for us? Wow, wouldn't that be a different structure? And wouldn't that be more efficient? And that's what the example Ace Hardware, that's what that is. That's what REI is. That's what a lot of these co-ops are, is where the administrators are working for the employees, or even to some extent the mutuals out there, some of these insurance companies like Mass Mutual. The idea is, at least unless they get corrupted, which happens often, is that your management, your administrators are working for the customers or working for the employees.
So this is where I want to get back to public policy, where let's take our Uber driver. So they're not even considered employees,
right?
They're considered contract workers, where smart public legislation would show that would put them as employees. Are you familiar with conscious capitalism?
Mm-hmm.
So under conscious capitalism, the basic idea is that creating a profit is an important part of a company, but it's only one part of a company. The environment, the employees, the suppliers, government, right? Everybody's kind of a part of this larger package. It kind of fits into all the different stakeholders form what we think of as the important people within a company. And that's where I would like to see things going. Probably less. I'm a little more skeptical of a co-op as a solution, but much more about regulation stepping in and detailing the relationship between employees and their company. I have another question.
That's the question: is do we wait for what's it, AOC to step in, our new congresswoman, and legislate this? I feel like the system that we're in, the sort of social system, is not just like allergic to regulation, but it kind of sees regulation coming, on the horizon, and figures out how to adjust and counter to it. So while I'm all for it, and I'm all for voting for people who want to enact legislation in the good old fashioned government way, I'd love to get a government with as much regulation and taxation as those good old leftist Ronald Reagan days, say. I mean, compared to our time, I mean, that would be considered, so, Reagan would be considered a socialist today if people were going to, use his policies. But I'm looking instead at sort of the way people make choices for their companies. I mean, and that was sort of my last book, Throwing Rocks at the Google Bus. I was really trying to show CEOs, particularly of technology companies, how they can create a more profitable, long-term, resilient, sustainable company using less scorched earth tactics. And I still believe that's the case.
When was the best time to be alive?
I mean, that's hard to say. I mean, being alive is the thing. I mean, the best time to be alive is when you're 17.
Any age.
Yeah.
At any time in the world.
I mean, I would have to say, I mean, I hate to say it, I would have to say now, because, right now we're at, we have the opportunity to, in some sense, to save civilization. We have the opportunity. This is a really important pivot point. We've never had tools of this power before. We've never had this much of an impact on, the fate of this planet. So I mean, I can't say, when or what. It would have been. I mean, there's some other times or situations I would have liked to experience.
Because your book, I asked because in the book, it feels like it has nostalgia for some previous time that was before technology.
Well, yeah, it's like, how far back do you go? I mean, that's the problem. So, you can look at every, and this is part of why I do it as an exercise, you can look at every technology as having had this sort of golden period until it becomes exploitative. So the internet was all social and back and forth until it got commercial. Then you can go back and look at TV and radio that way. Radio was great when it was ham radio and informational, and then it becomes Hitler's tool or communist China's tool. You can look back at...
But now we have podcasts.
Yeah, now we have podcasts. I mean, yeah, which are good again. I think. But then you could go back to the invention of text, and on the one hand, it got us the idea of progress, the covenant with God, writing the Torah, and the idea that we're gonna have a history and a future. So there's progress. And the law got invented because of text. But you look at the very first uses of text, it was used for counting slaves and keeping track of human property, humans as property. You look at language, so, okay, great, language let, hunter-gatherers, organize their hunting parties and things, but it also allowed people to lie for the first time and to prevaricate. So how far, and language, the noun, once you label something, you've essentially killed it. You've started the process of abstraction. So people then start to believe in these abstractions rather than the flesh and blood reality in front of them. So it's like, what, are we going to go back and then just start grunting again? It's like, how far back do you have to go, to have none of the corruption? Well, you'd have to go back before awareness.
Here's the thing is that, I think of the iPhone. I read that it's the line that I really love is that the iPhone is the remote control to the real world. And when I was in Chicago recently, I'm walking around the streets and I'm 1,000 times smarter with my iPhone than without it.
Well, you're 1,000 times more informed.
That's what I mean. I'm a hybrid machine,
right.
Human machine.
Right. You're informed about the modern techno-civilization. Right. If you were in the you're in the rainforest with that thing, I don't know.
But I'm in Chicago and I'm trying to figure out what to eat and where to go and who to meet up with, where to meet, right? And all of these things. And I'm looking up about Chicago.
Right. So, but it's a kludge. In other words, society's gotten so complex, so manipulative, so awful that now you need this machine. So it's like, I remember on Star Trek, Mr. Spock had his tricorder, but you would use the tricorder to navigate an alien terrain. You're using the tricorder to navigate your home. that's a disconnected feeling. I don't want to navigate my own world with a tool, especially if the Yelp, Google, whatever search things on there are being paid for by people who don't have my best interests at heart anyway. What's not showing up there? Whoever's not buying the Google ads and the stuff to show up on their friggin' maps.
So I was wondering if you can just step into how you would like to see this renaissance, the new world forming, given all the problems that we've talked about and all the challenges. What would a renaissance world look like?
Well, it's not up to me to envision the Renaissance world that we move into. I mean, I think I see the very first steps we can take to reorient ourselves. For me, I think one of the most important first steps is for us to learn to see other people as allies rather than as competitors. And that's to relearn how to make eye contact, how to establish rapport, how to conspire, breathe together with other people. So I would ask for really some small shifts, and people are waking up to it. When you're in a public space, to be not on your phone, but to be looking around and seeing other people, to have our classrooms less geared towards the utilitarian value of training tomorrow's workers, and instead the more humanist value of really, if anything, compensating people for the work that they're going to be doing. That was the original point of public education, was so that, the coal miner would get to live a dignified life. When he got out of the coal mines and went home, he'd be able to read a novel or understand the news so he could vote intelligently. And now we've turned school into an extension of work, a way for corporations to externalize the cost of job training. So I want people to have and to seize time to celebrate being human, being with other people. I want to celebrate the quirkiness. I want people to value humans rather than to think that that human beings are just a weight or a cost. If you start up a company, the more humans you have, the less money you're going to raise. Unless you're doing like acqui-hires, they don't want humans. They want to be able to scale up infinitely, and any human being is the enemy. And that's a problem. We've been really pushing humans out of the equation for such a long period of time that now we have a popular culture that can't distinguish between humans and zombies, where the robot.
I think you have an interesting part about that centers around the arts in the book.
Yeah,
discussing the importance of the arts and comedy and some of these more only human to human experiences.
Yeah, I mean, I really appreciated David Lynch's Twin Peaks revival that they did on Showtime, and part of what I appreciated about it is that it was kind of the anti-spoiler prestige television. The prestige TV we have now, it's always about how many episodes in do you find out that, one character or two characters are just one person. You have your Fight Club moment where, oh, I'm also him. Oh, don't tell anybody that though. So, we're all watching our Netflix shows alone. No one can talk to anyone else about it because, I'm on Game of Thrones season 4, episode 9, and you're on season 6, episode 4. So I can't tell you that the dragon's going to die, or, it's like, geez, when did TV become something you're not allowed to talk about anymore? Is scary in itself. But the idea of the sort of commercial art is so much about the spoiler, which is like this piece of IP, like a little IP landmine, intellectual property that then when it explodes, it's kind of useless. It's over. So you don't want to tell it to someone else. Where what Lynch was doing with Twin Peaks, he would put the camera on somebody just sweeping the floor for 5 minutes, or stuff that didn't make sense in a traditional way, as if to train the viewer to say, look, stop worrying about the plot, stop worrying about the spoilers, start looking at the behavior, I'll
be honest, I'm just as guilty. I mean, I can't watch a film from 1945. It's too slow.
Well, that's a different thing.
But it's similar, right? It's that we're at a different pace.
It's not just the pace, though. I mean, you look at I understand. I mean, but there's a difference between a murder mystery of 1945, and Citizen Kane, or a movie. It has to do with this sort of. I guess what I'm rebelling against is a particular kind of narrative. These beginning, middle, end. People pay their money. They want their conclusion. How does this end? What's the moral of the story? Where does it go? And we are really allergic to these kind of open-ended, more experiential experiences, the things that are more like real life. And that's of a concern to me, that we are growing intolerant of what real life is like. And I understand that. If you're online at Disneyland, I'm not going to complain that your kid is texting their friends or doing Instagrams because they're standing online. But when you're moving through the world, our relationship to our media and to our devices is weird. We're looking for premature conclusion, and that's troublesome to me. But I'm really into art and culture that celebrates the weird, quirky, liminal states, the stuff that can't be just imitated by machine, because I believe part of what makes us human is our ability to sustain ambivalence or ambiguity, it's not yes or no. It's not Mexican or American. It's not red state or blue state. It's both. It's neither. It's weird. I have mixed feelings. And it's okay to have mixed feelings. That's where the good stuff is in all of that confusion and ambiguity. And the more we surrender to the values of the current digital media environment, the more we want everything to be a yes or a no, a 1 or a 0, to resolve in this way or that way. And that's the end. That's death, is resolution. And it's great if people like death, but the death cults, back to the Bible, the death cults of Egypt is what we got away from. The certainty. It's the uncertainty we need to start to love. If we don't, then we will end this thing. We will end this because life, being alive and human, is just too intolerable for us.
All right. I think we're about out of time. Would you mind reading the paragraph on page 172?
Basically saying that I'm not anti-technology. I'm really pro-technology. I just want us to kind of retrieve what's human and embed the digital future with the human rather than just go blindly forward. And then I have this, I kind of explain it. I say, this is the first lesson a whitewater rafter learns on encountering the rapids. As the raft enters the turbulence and begins to buck, the temptation to resist the current by jamming the paddle straight down into the water and holding it still as still as possible. Another temptation is to remove the paddle altogether and surrender to the current. Both strategies put the raft at the mercy of the river. The best response is to paddle harder and faster, go with the current, making the necessary adjustments to avoid rocks and other obstacles. It's neither resistance nor passivity, but active participation, working in concert with what's happening to make it downriver in one piece.
All right, that was excellent.
And obviously the idea is how do you take charge of the situation you're in? You don't panic, you don't put your head in the sand, and you don't just go with the flow, but you participate. You join the fray. You use what's there to keep going. I'm afraid right now we're using both of those opposite reactions now. People are either, putting their heads in the sand and going, it's just going to be fine, I'm not going to worry about it. Or, they're just trying to stop the whole thing. Let's have no technology, no computers, no TV, no money, And it's like, no. We're here. Now what? And that's, and that's really the call to arms. That's the, come on, this is an all hands on deck moment. It's time to arrive as human beings and take charge of this world that we've developed.
All right. Well, Douglas, thanks for joining me.
No, thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to the podcast today. If you have any questions or comments, you can email me at jeffshatten1@gmail.com. You can tweet me at jeffshatten. If you like this podcast, press the subscribe button and make sure to rate it on iTunes so that other people can find it.